Hello everyone, viewers. We all know the story. The 18th of June, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte, the titan who had brought Europe to its knees, suffers his final crushing defeat. The history books tell a clear tale, a muddy field, a delayed attack, the stubborn British, and the last minute arrival of the Prussians. A story of military miscalculation. But what if the most famous battle in modern history was not a battle at all, but a meticulously staged execution? What if Napoleon's defeat was sealed not by Wellington or B.L. Fitcher, but by a secret handshake in a dark room weeks before a single shot was fired? We're told his marshals made fatal errors, but what if they weren't errors? What if they were orders from an authority higher than the emperor? Today, we peel back the pages of accepted history to reveal the terrifying possibility of a conspiracy at the very heart of Napoleon's army. A secret society that decided the fate of a continent. If you are ready to question everything you've learned about the end of Napoleon's reign, make sure you are subscribed and hit that like button, because the rabbit hole goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. Our story begins not on the blood-soaked fields of Belgium, but on a windswept island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Elba, a cage for an eagle. For 10 months, the world believed Napoleon Bonaparte was finished. Exiled, humiliated, guarded by British ships, the old monarchies of Europe, the Bourbons, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, breathed a collective sigh. They gathered in Vienna, quaffing champagne and redrawing the map of Europe, confident the Corsican ogre was safely locked away. They were fools. They had caged the man, but not the idea. An idea of a world where birthright meant less than merit, where a common man could become an emperor. This idea was a virus in the blood of the old world, and its primary carrier was on the night of the 26th of February, 1815, under the cover of darkness, Napoleon slipped past his guards, boarded the brig Inconstant, and sailed for France. With him were less than 1,000 men from his old guard. It was a gamble of such breathtaking audacity that no one believed it possible. As his small flotilla approached the French coast, they passed a royalist ship. Napoleon himself seized a speaking trumpet and shouted back, "The Emperor is in excellent health." The world was about to be turned upside down again. He landed near Cannes and began his march to Paris. The restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, fat and gout, ridden, dismissed him as a minor threat. He sent an army to intercept and destroy him. Nay, the bravest of the brave promised the king he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. Near Grenoble, the two forces met. Napoleon's tiny band faced a royalist army, their muskets levelled, their cannons primed. This should have been the end. But Napoleon did the unthinkable. He dismounted his horse and walked forward alone. His famous grey coat up. He walked until he was within pistol shot of the men sent to kill him, and then he stopped. "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment," he boomed, his voice carrying across the silent field. "Do you recognize me? If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." For a heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. The fate of Europe hung on a single trigger finger. Then, a cry. The soldiers tore the white cockades of the Bourbon king from their hats and rushed forward, not to capture him, but to kneel at his feet. Marshal Ney, the man who promised an iron cage, found his resolve melting away. His own soldiers were deserting to their old commander. He had no choice. He, too, pledged his sword to Napoleon. The march to Paris became a triumphal procession. Every garrison joined his cause. King Louis XVIII fled the country without a single shot being fired in his defense. On the 20th of March, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte walked into the Tuileries Palace in Paris and was once again the master of France. But while the people of France celebrated, the masters of Europe trembled. In Vienna, the news of Napoleon's return landed like a thunderclap. The squabbling kings and princes, who had been on the verge of war with each other over the spoils of their previous victory, were suddenly united by a single terrifying threat. They declared Napoleon Bonaparte an outlaw, an enemy of humanity. They formed the 7th Coalition, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and a host of smaller states, and pledged to raise an army of over 1 million men. This was not just a war against a man, it was a crusade against the revolution he represented. But behind the public declarations and the marching armies, something else was stirring. In the candle-lit chambers and Masonic lodges of Vienna, London, and Berlin, a different kind of war was being planned. A war of shadows, to understand. This war, you have to understand who Napoleon's not just the kings and emperors, but the ancient aristocratic families who had ruled Europe for 1,000 years. The ones who believed they governed by divine right, that their blood was inherently superior. To them, Napoleon was an abomination, a Corsican upstart, a product of chaos, a man who crowned himself. He had swept away their ancient privileges, redrawn their sacred borders. He had to be destroyed, but not just defeated. His legend, his very idea, had to be extinguished. And for that, a simple battlefield victory was not enough. The defeat had to be absolute, humiliating, and most importantly, it had to look like his own fault. It had to be a failure of his own genius. For years, a clandestine network had been working towards this goal. They were a web of influence, a brotherhood of Europe's elite, bankers in London who controlled the coalition's finances, diplomats in Vienna who manipulated treaties, and most importantly, high-ranking officers and aristocrats embedded in every army in Europe, including Napoleon's. Their methods were not assassination or open rebellion. They were far more subtle, a misplaced order, a whispered word of doubt in a general's ear at a critical moment. Their ultimate weapon was betrayal, masked as incompetence. When Napoleon returned, the order saw its golden opportunity. They knew he would have to raise a new army quickly. He would be forced to rely on men whose loyalty was questionable, men who had served the Bourbon king, men who had grown rich and tired of war, men like Marshal men like Marshal Soult, his new chief of staff, a brilliant general, but also a notorious opportunist who had served the restored king with enthusiasm, and men like Emmanuel de Grouchy, a competent cavalry commander, but an aristocrat by birth, whose family had suffered under the Revolution. These men were the weak links, and the order of restoration began to pull at the threads. Back in Paris, he knew he was outnumbered and outmatched. His only hope was to strike first, to hit the coalition armies in Belgium before the massive Russian and Austrian forces could arrive from the east. His plan was brilliant, a classic Napoleonic strategy. The British under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians under Marshal B.L. Fitcher were camped separately. Napoleon planned to drive a wedge between them, defeat them one at a time, and force the speed and surprise were everything. But from the very beginning, things started to go wrong. Small things at first, a strange slowness in the army's mobilization, orders that seemed to take hours longer than they should to reach their destinations. Marshal Soult, his chief of staff, seemed overwhelmed. He forgot to send crucial instructions to one corps commander. He used a single messenger to carry a vital dispatch. My old chief of staff, Berthier, would have sent 6 messengers, he raged. But Berthier was dead, having mysteriously fallen from a window in Bavaria just weeks earlier. An accident. Or was the order's work already underway, despite the delays? The campaign began. On the 15th of June, Napoleon crossed into Belgium, achieving the strategic surprise he needed. The next day, the 16th of June, was the day of the twin battles, Ligny and Quatre Bras. Napoleon himself attacked the Prussians under Bligny, while he sent Marshal Ney to seize the crucial crossroads of Quatre Bras, which would prevent Wellington's British army from coming to the Prussians' aid. At Ligny, Napoleon was triumphant. He smashed the Prussian centre, inflicting terrible casualties and sending B.L. Fitcher's army into a chaotic retreat. It was a tactical masterpiece, but something was wrong. A whole army corps, the I Corps under General d'Erlon, had spent the entire day marching back and forth between the two battlefields, never engaging in either. Why? A series of confusing and contradictory orders. One from At Ligny, their arrival could have turned a victory into the complete annihilation of the Prussian army at Quatre Bras. They would have given Ney the numbers he needed to sweep Wellington aside. Instead, they did nothing. The official story blames the fog of war, a catastrophic blunder in communication, but the members of the order would have called it a success. One general, one corps, neutralized without a single. Marshal Ney, the man renowned for his almost reckless aggression, was strangely hesitant. He delayed his attack on the crossroads for hours, allowing Wellington to reinforce the position when he finally did attack. It was a piecemeal, uncoordinated effort. The bravest of the brave seemed to have lost his nerve. He failed to take the crossroads. And because of this, Wellington was able to disengage his army in good order, while the battered Prussians were allowed to retreat without being pursued into oblivion. Napoleon had won a victory at Ligny, but it was incomplete. The two Allied armies were still in the field. The trap had not been sprung. The Emperor was furious with Ney. "You have ruined France," he told him. Or was he a puppet? His strings being pulled by forces he didn't understand, whispers in his camp perhaps, a friendly suggestion from a subordinate, an aide-de-camp who was secretly a member of the order. "My Lord Marshal, the woods to the east are surely filled with Wellington's reserves. Caution is advised." Simple words, deadly effect. The next day, the 17th of June, a torrential biblical downpour turned the fields of Belgium into a sea of mud. It slowed Napoleon's pursuit of Wellington to a crawl, allowing the British to establish a strong defensive position on a ridge near a small village called Waterloo. And it was on this day that Napoleon made the most fateful decision of the campaign. He split his army. He gave command of a third of his forces, some 33,000 men and nearly 100 cannons, to Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy. His orders were explicit: pursue the retreating Prussians. Keep them away from Wellington. Do not let the two Allied armies reunite. The fate of the war now rested on Grouchy's shoulders, and Grouchy was a man the Order of Restoration had been watching very, very closely. He was known to be meticulous, a man who followed orders to the letter, a perfect tool, a man who could be relied upon to do exactly what he was told, even if it led to disaster. As the sun rose on the 18th of June, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte was confident. Wellington was trapped. The British were skilled defenders, but Napoleon had faced them before. He had more men, more cannons. And Grouchy was out there hunting the Prussians. "This affair," he told his generals, "is no more serious than eating one's breakfast." But his breakfast was about to be interrupted. The battle began around 11:30 a.m., delayed for hours to allow the ground to dry. A massive French artillery barrage, the Grand Battery, opened up on the British lines on the ridge of Mont. St. Jean, the earth, then the first French infantry attack, a diversionary assault on the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank. What was meant to be a feint to draw in British reserves became a bloody day-long battle in its own right, sucking in thousands of French troops for no strategic gain. Was it the overzealousness of the French commander, Napoleon's own brother Jerome, or was it the first step in a preordained plan? The main attack came an hour later. General d'Erlon's corps, the same corps that had spent the 16th of June marching uselessly, advanced on Wellington's left. Centre, 16,000 men marching in dense columns. It was a terrifying sight. But the formation was outdated, clumsy, vulnerable to artillery and cavalry. Why was it used? Did d'Erlon, an experienced general, suddenly forget or was he instructed to use a formation that was destined to fail? The British infantry, hidden behind the reverse slope of the ridge, waited until the French were almost upon them. Then, on Wellington's command, they rose as one and unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire at point. Blank range, the French columns staggered, broke, and fled. As they retreated in disarray, the British heavy cavalry, the Scots Greys and the Household Brigade, charged. They smashed into the fleeing infantry, a whirlwind of horseflesh and steel. But their charge went too far. Carried away by bloodlust, they galloped on towards the French cannons, becoming disorganized and exhausted. Napoleon saw his chance and unleashed his lancers. Two of Wellington's finest brigades were shattered. A tactical victory for Napoleon, but a strategic disaster. It was another case of a commander's aggression leading to ruin. But what if it wasn't just bloodlust? The commander of the British cavalry was the Earl of Uxbridge, A brave man, but also a high-ranking British aristocrat, a man who moved in the same circles as the members of the order. Was his order to charge, or was it a calculated sacrifice designed to lure Napoleon's cavalry into a counter-trap and weaken both sides? The battle raged for hours, a brutal, grinding affair. The French assaulted the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, the key to Wellington's centre. The German defenders fought with incredible bravery, holding out for hours against overwhelming odds. But their ammunition. They sent desperate requests for resupply, but the requests were bungled. The wrong type of cartridges were sent. The quartermaster responsible claimed it was a mistake. But was it? La Haye-Sainte finally fell in the late afternoon. Napoleon now had a foothold in the centre of Wellington's line. The British position was critical. Victory was within the Emperor's grasp. This was the moment, and this is when Marshal Ney made his most infamous blunder. Seeing what he mistook for a general retreat in the British centre, it was merely the movement of wounded men to the rear. Ney ordered a massive cavalry charge, not just one brigade, not just one division, almost the entire French heavy cavalry reserve, thousands of armoured cuirassiers, lancers and dragoons, a torrent of steel, but a violation of the most basic military doctrine. Napoleon, watching from his command post, was horrified. "He is compromising us. It is an hour too soon," he exclaimed. The French cavalry charged up the muddy slope, wave after wave. They crested the ridge and found not a broken army, but the British infantry formed in squares, living fortresses of men and bayonets. They swirled around the squares, firing their pistols, slashing with their sabres, but the disciplined redcoats held firm. For 2 hours the flower of French cavalry threw itself against the unbreakable British squares, and for 2 hours they were shot to pieces. They charged, retreated, reformed, and charged again. It was magnificent, it was heroic, and it was pointless. Ney, his face black with he was a man possessed, seeking death. But was he possessed by a lust for glory, or by the knowledge that he was sending his men to die for a lost cause? Was he trying to win the battle? Or was he deliberately destroying Napoleon's last great mobile reserve? Meanwhile, miles to the east, another drama was unfolding. Marshal Grouchy and his 33,000 men were having lunch. Around his second in command, General Gefferard, recognized it immediately. "It is the cannon of Waterloo," he exclaimed. "We must march to the sound of the guns." It was the militarily correct thing to do. It was what Napoleon would have expected. It was common sense, but Grouchy refused. He had his orders: pursue the Prussians. He insisted on following those orders to the letter, even though the situation had clearly... The salvation of France is at stake. But Grouchy would not be swayed. "My orders are to march on Wavre," he said stiffly, and so while their emperor fought for his life just a few miles away, Grouchy's corps continued its slow, methodical march in the wrong direction. His men could hear the battle raging, a constant, dull roar to the west. They knew they were needed, but their commander, bound by a fate... His pursuit of the Prussians was a phantom chase. The bulk of the Prussian army, under the command of the grizzled old Marshal B.A. Feature, had not retreated east as Grouchy assumed. After their defeat at Ligny, they had miraculously regrouped and were now marching not away from the battle, but towards it. They were marching to save Wellington. The order's plan was reaching its crescendo. Ney's cavalry was Grouchy's corps was absent, and now, on Napoleon's right flank, the first black-clad figures of the Prussian advance guard began to emerge from the woods. Napoleon's incredible mind understood the situation instantly. He had to break Wellington's line now, before the Prussians could arrive in force. He had one last reserve, his ultimate weapon, the Imperial Guard, the Immortals. The men who had marched with him from the pyramids of Egypt to the snows of Moscow, veterans of 100 battles, they had never known defeat when he led them personally. He gathered 10 battalions of the Middle Guard and prepared for the final assault. He spoke to them himself. "Soldiers, all of Europe is watching you. The fate of France is in your hands." With cries of "Vive l'Empereur," the guard, a column of bearskin hats and grim, determined faces marching into the setting sun. They marched past Ney, who, on foot, his sword broken, offered to lead them. They marched into a storm of canister and musket fire. They broke through the first British line. For a moment it seemed the legend was true. They were invincible. Wellington himself rode among his men, shoring up the line. The British guards, who had been lying down to avoid the artillery, rose to meet them. The two most elite forces in Europe met face to face. "Now, Maitland, now's your time," Wellington cried. A volley crashed out at 20 paces. The front rank of the Imperial Guard disappeared in a cloud of smoke. They faltered. They stopped. For the first time in their history, they hesitated. Then, the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard broke. A cry went through the French army, a sound of pure disbelief and horror. "La Garde recule," the Guard retreats. It was the signal for a general collapse. The entire French army, which had fought so bravely for 8 hours, dissolved into a panicked mob at that same moment. The bulk of B.L. Fitcher's Prussian army slammed into Napoleon's right. It was a rout. Wellington gave the signal for a general advance. The British and Prussians swept across the field, a vengeful tide. Napoleon was caught in the torrent of fleeing men. His marshals formed a square around him, begging him to escape. "Sire, you must leave. The enemy is upon us." He seemed to be in a daze, muttering, "It cannot be. It cannot be." He had not been outfought. He had been dismantled piece by piece. His plans had been thwarted by a series of blunders so perfectly timed, so strategically devastating, that they defied coincidence. D'Erlon's phantom march, Ney's hesitant attack at Quatre Bras, La Haye Santé's lack of ammunition, Ney's suicidal cavalry charge, and finally Grouchy's inexplicable absence. It was a pattern. It was a design. Imagine Napoleon in that final moment, his world collapsing around him. He is not just seeing a battle being lost, he is seeing the strings. He is realizing the entire battle was a stage, and he was the lead actor in a tragedy written by his enemies. Every mistake made by his most trusted commanders was a line from their script. When Grouchy marched on Wavre, he wasn't being stupid. He was obeying a higher command, the command of the Order of Restoration, whose goal was not just to defeat him, but to make him the architect of his own destruction. The rain that fell on the 17th of June, a happy accident for the coalition, or was the battle deliberately delayed? The timing manipulated by insiders who knew that the Prussian army was on the march. The idea that human agency, a secret cabal, could even manipulate the consequences of the weather. As Napoleon fled the field, a broken man, the hunt was on. The Prussians, who had a special hatred for him, pursued him relentlessly, taking no prisoners. He barely escaped capture, riding all night until he reached the French border, his great gamble, the 100 days. The politicians who had hailed his return now demanded his abdication. Men like Fouché and Talleyrand, masters of survival, were already negotiating with the coalition. Were they part of the order too, the highest-ranking members, perhaps playing the long game from the safety of their Parisian salons? Napoleon abdicated for a second time. He tried to flee to America. He threw himself on the mercy of the British, his oldest and most implacable foes, hoping for a gentleman's retirement in the English countryside. Instead, they exiled him to the most remote place they could find, St. Helena, a tiny volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. Thousands of miles from anywhere, the eagle was not just caged, it was buried alive, and it was there, on that lonely rock, under the 6 years, to replay the Battle of Waterloo in his mind, over and over again. He wrote his memoirs. He dictated his thoughts on warfare, on politics, on history, and he tried to understand what had happened. He blamed the weather. He blamed Ney's hot-headedness. He blamed Grouchy's incompetence. He blamed Soult's inexperience as a chief of staff. He laid the blame everywhere, but in his more private moments, in the ramblings recorded by his companions, a darker suspicion emerged. He spoke of treason. He spoke of a fatal destiny. He couldn't prove it. The Order of Restoration, if it existed, had been too clever. Its members had faded back into the shadows. Their work done, they had taken their places in the restored monarchies of Europe, their secrets safe. just a series of inexplicable failures that, when viewed together, paint a portrait of a breathtakingly brilliant conspiracy. Marshal Grouchy was caught, marshalled, but acquitted. He lived to a ripe old age, forever protesting that he had simply followed his orders. Marshal Ney was not so lucky. The restored Bourbon monarchy, seeking a scapegoat, had him arrested for treason. He was sentenced to death on the 7th of December 1815 in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. He stood before a firing squad. He refused a blindfold. "Soldiers," he said, his voice firm, "when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart." He gave the command himself. Was his death the final act of a patriot, or the silence of a man who knew too much? A conspirator who... The official history of Waterloo is set in stone. It is a story of mud mistakes and the steadfastness of the British square. It is a story that serves the victors well, for it attributes their triumph to their own virtues and Napoleon's flaws. But the whispers remain, the nagging questions, the coincidences that are too neat. The idea that history is not always shaped by grand armies and famous men, but sometimes by faceless... The Order of Restoration, or whatever it called itself, achieved its goal. Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821. The revolutionary idea he represented was suppressed. The old monarchies were restored. The world was made safe again for kings and aristocrats for a time. But the story doesn't end there, because an idea, once unleashed, can never be truly killed. And the methods of the order manipulation from within, the use of incompetence as a weapon, the secret war fought in the corridors of power, did they vanish with Napoleon? Or did they simply evolve, adapting to new centuries, new conflicts, new ideologies? Look at the great, inexplicable disasters of modern history. The moments when victory was inexplicably snatched from the jaws, the moments when brilliant leaders made bafflingly stupid decisions. Is it all just chaos and human error, or are the strings still being pulled by unseen hands? The story of Waterloo is a warning. It teaches us that the official narrative is often the one that is most convenient, that the truth is often buried beneath layers of propaganda and simplification, and that the real battles that shape our world may not be the ones we read about in history books. All right. That is all for today's video. The story of Napoleon's potential betrayal is a fascinating and disturbing one that challenges our understanding of a pivotal moment in history. What do you think? Was it a series of tragic blunders or a perfectly executed conspiracy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and give it a like to support us. Thank you for watching.